Okay, if we let's reconvene. So next up we have Susan Kenyon, who's going to introduce the topic of multitasking in everyday life through technology. So take it away, Susan.
Thank you. Thanks very much. As Joe said, I'm Susan Kenyon. I'm not from Chimera. I'm from the University of Kent. But one thing I would like to say, first of all, is that the research that I'm reporting was undertaken when I was employed at the Centre for Transport and Society at the University of the West of England. And so I'm very grateful to them for supporting the research. And thank you also to the EPSRC and the DFT who funded the research. So here's an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'll talk firstly about what is multitasking and why it matters, and I'll say something about that on 3 levels, thinking about the conceptualisation of time. It might surprise some of you here to realise that there's actually no agreed definition of what time is or understanding of what time is. I'll keep that theoretical discussion brief, but I think it's important to recognise that those debates are going on. I'll also talk about the understanding of time use and the understanding of space-time relationships as well. Then I'll be talking about multitasking and internet use, and within that I'll be saying a little bit about the nature of time and internet use as well, and the ways that the concept of time is going to be conceptualised in light of the internet. Then, as Ben said, this study involves a number of different methodologies, and today I'll be talking about 2 of them. I'll be talking about a diary-based data set where we collected time use data over a period of a year, and I'll be talking about a questionnaire survey as well. And the different kind, and as Ben was saying, you can ask different kinds of questions in different kinds of forums, and that will come out when I tell you about the methodology and the sample. Then, as you can see, I'll present the results, and we'll have a short discussion about the implications of the findings and my ideas for the future research direction. So, these are just to introduce the concept of multitasking. I've got 2 images here. First one, as you can see over here, highlights one definition of multitasking, which is the one that we think about every day, i.e. we're doing 2 things at once. So here you can relax and do more at the same time. And so the explicit reference here is to the fact that technology can help you to do this. It can help you to watch the football and work on your Word document at the same time. The second understanding of multitasking that you can see here, when I was in South Africa, I discovered these fantastic Topler bars. I did buy a job lot of them and took them home, intending to be able to use them as props in presentation. Sadly, they didn't last that long, so we've got a photo of it instead. And as you can see, the bar 1, which is very like a Mars bar, is for the 24-hour day. We all know there's only 24 hours in the day, but the idea is that with multitasking, we're able to squeeze more time into the day, so we can have a 25-hour day if we multitask. So, what is multitasking and why does it matter? Now, this is my definition of multitasking that I use in my research, and it's quite important. There is a debate about whether or not we can multitask, and this definition is very much orientated towards my study and towards the methodology that I use. So you can see there's a stress that multitasking is the simultaneous conduct of 2 or more activities during a given time period. And that latter aspect is quite important. It means that we can move away from the more psychological aspects of multitasking as to whether or not our brain is capable of doing more than one thing at once. And it means that we can orientate it towards the time diaries that we're using. So it suggests that multitasking is possible considering the time episodes used in the majority of surveys. Okay? So there are implications of multitasking for definitions of time. Now, when we talk about time, we're pretty much thinking in the main about clock time. Clock time is a vertical construct, a hierarchical construct, where we see time as progressing through insulated stages in the day. So we have 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and time progresses through this vertical hierarchical channel When we think about multitasking, however, we can see that time is broadened out. We have multiple time periods at any one clock time period in the day. So we can think of deepening of time, or we can think of the broadening of time. So we're seeing time not as a vertical entity, but now more of a horizontal construct. Okay? Does that make sense? Yeah. Thank you. You're much more receptive than my students are. There are also implications...
Sorry, I'm going to be right. That doesn't make sense to me.
Doesn't make sense. Okay.
Vertical, horizontal, in your first definition you're looking at vertically fine. I don't see why you can look at it horizontally or diagonally or anything. You're saying it's discrete blocks with calibrations that it passes between. Okay, and then if there's multiple tasks going on, then they might start at different times, but they're not being measured on the same calibrations or system. I don't know why it suddenly becomes more than one.
Right. It becomes more than one because we're not thinking anymore about clock time. Clock time is a definition of time. When we conceptualise time, there are lots of different ways that we can do that. One way in which it's done is by looking at the clock. Now, the clock is a social construct. It doesn't actually exist outside of our construction of it, if you understand what I mean. Pardon?
Yeah, okay.
Okay. And so with the clock, we progress from minute to minute or second to second, but there isn't anything outside of that clock time. It's a very narrow construct of time. But when we think about multitasking, we're actually recognising that time isn't that narrow. It's actually quite much broader than that. So when so you can see by the graphic, you can see that time is expanding sideways almost. So you could almost say that we have many clock times running in parallel with each other. Okay, so we're thinking of many different aspects of time, different definition. Okay, you're too afraid to say no, aren't you? Okay. There are also time use is very important for public policy. Obviously, time, the way we use time, is important for indications of well-being, of participation in society, work, or whatever. But our understanding of time use can change when we start thinking about multitasking. And this is important for when we're trying to understand policy interventions, for example, if we're trying to understand how many minutes or hours a day people are spending in work, for example. We want to address that, or in leisure or in socialising. What we're suggesting is that if we take into account multitasking, then our perception of how much time people spend in each of these discrete activities actually increases. Because if you're doing more than one thing at once, you need to start measuring multitasking to get a better understanding of how people are behaving, how they're participating in society. There are very few studies, actually, in time use studies that have taken account of multitasking. It's recognised that it's important, but it is under-researched. But studies that there are suggest that we're multitasking for about a third of the day, a third of the time that of the day, and that's including sleeping. So for about half of the time that we're awake, studies suggest that we're multitasking. And there's a consensus that when we don't record multitasking, this leads to underreporting and biased accounts of time use and activity participation. We're underreporting especially childcare. So it's estimated that 75% of childcare is spent as is recorded as a secondary activity rather than a primary activity. We're underreporting domestic work, passive leisure, and communications activities. Now, obviously, all of these are very important for things like gender equity in society or the productivity of people in society. And they're also important for the debate about the effects of the internet and communications upon time use. So if we're looking to understand the effects of change, we have to start recognising that time might not be a zero-sum game. Instead of looking for changes at the aggregate level, at the level of primary activities, if we look at change involving multitasking as well, we might see that things aren't merely added or subtracted from daily life. So they're not really substituted in daily life, they can be added as well. Okay? So it's important for the definition of time and for the understanding of time use. Multitasking is also important for the methodologies that we use. It's actually quite difficult to measure time use, and this is possibly a reason why people haven't tended to do it, because people generally don't tend to be aware of when they're multitasking. It's very difficult to ask them to record it because it's quite onerous, and it's also very difficult to analyse. And you'll see that the results that I'll be presenting from the time use data are quite basic descriptive statistics, because it's hard to do any more analysis than that. Okay, so why might the internet influence time use? We see a move, very briefly, we can think about the conceptualisation of time. So we move from the idea of clock time to the idea of real time and network time. Castells, who many of you may be aware of, he talks about real time and the death of clock time. Hassan moves on from this. He suggests, no, we're never going to see the death of clock time because it's just so fundamental to human society now. But he does suggest that with network time, with the internet, we're no longer governed by the rule and pace of the clock. And he suggests that this may be shown in a return to task time. So instead of being governed by how fast the clock is going, or by the fact that the clock is saying it's 10 o'clock at night and now it's bedtime, that would be me, maybe it's midnight for you, I'm an early bird. So he is suggesting that actually the way that we use time in society and our behaviour, our temporal patterns are changing because of the internet. It might be important for time use. When we think about the influence of the internet upon time use, there's been a focus upon the substitution of time, as I've said, substitution of activities to fit in time use. There's been a focus on the social effects and the effects for transport in the literature, and the literature is very polarised in terms of internet good, internet bad. So people have tended to say, no, the internet can increase communications, or other people have said, no, it's bad for sociability. The internet can substitute for travel, or it's going to increase travel. The debate is very polarised, perhaps reflecting the novelty of the field, perhaps reflecting a lack of time use data. But there is consensus that the internet is influencing how we're using our time. And of course, if you're thinking about multitasking, you'll remember that we were talking about perhaps nothing is being substituted, perhaps activities on the internet are just being added to everyday life. Some of you who have a geographic background might recognise the name Hagastrand. When we're thinking about the relationship between time and space, this is another way in which the internet can be important when we think about time. Obviously, activities are separated in time and space. Now, if we can get rid of time-space distance using the internet, then many more activities become accessible to us. Activities become placeless and timeless. Time-space convergence is literally complete. So we're saying that the distance in time and space between activities is no longer important when we have the internet. And if that's the case, that means that many more activities are accessible to us anywhere we are, at any time that we are.
So can I just ask, are you talking about the context that an activity takes place? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm lost. Yeah.
So you're meaning space equates context, so if the context is online, then you can be lost from...
That's right. So historically, if you wanted to work, for example, you might have to travel to your workplace. Mm-hmm. However, with the internet, you're no longer separated in that spatial way. Okay. You might also not be separated in time either, because time can be fragmented online. You can participate, you can talk to somebody at midnight about your work if you wanted to, or you could send a message with a delay for them to receive it. Okay? And all of these three things you'll see will start to become important when we start talking about multitasking. Now, there are two preconditions for multitasking. Spatial co-presence, the activities have to be in the same place. Temporal co-presence, so they have to be you have to be able to do them at the same time. Okay? So for activities, for you to be able to multitask, these two things must be happening. The properties, necessary properties of the activity. Okay. Now, the internet we know that the influence can reduce. The internet can reduce locational dependence in space and time. So these are the reasons why the internet. We might suspect that the internet will make it easier to multitask. There's a reduced locational dependence in space and time. You can do the activity anywhere and at any time. The internet allows you to reduce the continuity of engagement. Okay, so you can start an activity, for example, your online grocery shopping. It can then be interrupted for you to go and cook your dinner or care for your child or talk to someone on the phone or whatever. And you can come back to that in a way that you can't do with offline activities. The degree of active and cognitive attention is also important in enabling multitasking. And the internet is successful in bringing activities to you that require less active attention and less cognitive attention. So not all activities will be available to be multitasked online. However, the internet is enabling these three things, which is bringing more activities to you, enabling a greater degree of multitasking. So here's the hypothesis of the research that we were working with. Internet use will lead to greater multitasking because of the greater ability to multitask when we're online. And then there will be attendant implications for our understanding of the impact of internet use upon activity participation and time use. So we're suggesting that not accounting for multitasking will lead to misleading perception of the impacts of the internet, and also that the internet may be affecting multitasking behaviour. Okay, so there are two aspects to that hypothesis. And of course from then we're suggesting that there will be consequences for time use and theories of time. Okay? So that was the hypothesis. Moving on to the study. The diary study, this is what the diary looked like. So you can see here, people didn't have to record too much information. Activities were pre-coded. So you wrote the activity code here, start and end time, where they were. You can see that they recorded who they were with, the sociability aspect. And here they had space to record up to 3 additional activities. The sample, it was a theoretical sample. We had 96 participants in the study. The study was repeated every 6 months, 3 times in March, October and March. There were 3 waves 6 months apart. And when you're interpreting the results, and if you wanted to look at the paper as well, which I'm happy to send you, please remember that this isn't a representative sample. So the results are very specific to this sample. I'm not claiming that the results apply to all of society at all. And we sampled on income, internet experience, location and transport mode because we found these to be important in looking at the impacts of the internet previously, in a previous study. So that was the diary study. Moving on to the questionnaire study, the methodology for the questionnaire. We asked people within a much broader questionnaire, we asked people whether or not multitasking influenced the ability to multitask online, influenced the choice to do the activity online rather than offline. Second question was, can you multitask more online than when you're offline? And the third question just asked them to tell us a little bit more about multitasking if they would like to. And the reason we included the qualitative response, the open text box, was because we wanted to make sure that we weren't restricting the question in any way. As I say, multitasking is a very new area of research, and we needed to make sure that we weren't imposing a structure on the questionnaire. The question was also filtered, so people were only asked about the influence of multitasking upon their decision to conduct the activity online rather than offline if they had previously selected that they did that activity online and offline. Now this was a much larger sample, demographically representative of weekly internet users in Great Britain, but again a word of caution about the results. It was overrepresented people with more internet experience and those who spent more time online. So again, it might not be applicable to the whole population. So, the results. We found that multitasking is very prevalent. It's very common. This is the diary study results. We found that multitasking is very common for the sample, and in fact that it adds 7.2 hours to every waking day. So the idea that you can have a 25-hour day, as bar 1 suggested, is borne out by these results. However, there's a very high degree of variation, as Ben was talking about with his results. And we had a look to see whether or not the variation can be attributed to any particular characteristic, to see whether or not certain people are multitasking more. We found this wasn't the case. That could be related to the size of the sample. It's much more likely, however, that the variation that we observed is related to different completion strategies. And this highlights a key problem with time diary research. Because people are completing the diary in their own way, in their own time, you can't actually control what they're telling you. And different people interpret instructions in different ways, even if you provide one-to-one tuition for them, which we did with this study. So what are people doing with this extra time? If we look at this table here, I hope you can see what we need to do is just concentrate on this column at the end here. You can see that we had 89 activity categories, and what we did is we collapsed them into the activities that we were interested in looking at. So this table doesn't show all of the data, it just shows some of the data that we're interested in looking at. You can see that when we record multitasking, our perception of how much time people spend in each of these activities increases by between 1% for work, paid work, and 194% when we think about social networks activities. So that suggests that people record social network activities as secondary activities much more than they record them as primary activities. And that could explain why, when we look at the effects of internet use, people hypothesise or people think that they can see a decline in sociability, a decline in communications when people are using the internet. Actually, there might not be a substitution of sociability. It might just be that the internet is added to everyday life. Multitasking isn't randomly distributed across activity types, as you can see here. So you can see that different activities are more likely to be multitasked or more able to be multitasked. And what's noticeable here is that when we record secondary activities, it increases our perception of how much time people are spending on the internet by 60%. And again, if we look at this table, if we concentrate on this column here, this table shows us, just briefly, that for 23% of the time that people are spending in education activities, they're multitasking. So 23% of the time spent in education is about multitasking. When they're in education offline, that reduces to 21%, but when they're in education online, it increases to 63%. So you can see that whether or not the internet, the activities online or offline, has an influence upon whether or not people can multitask. And you can see here as well that in most of them, if you look at the table, in most activities, except for social networks activities, people multitask more when they're online than when they're offline. So it does seem that the internet is increasing multitasking, is enabling multitasking. Something that's interesting is that 45% of the total time that people are online is multitasked. 43% of the total time that people are offline, excluding sleeping, is multitasked. Now that's not a very big difference, 45 to 43%, yet we do see very big differences here when we look at activity-focused analysis. And this really highlights the importance of activity-focused analysis in time use, rather than just taking online time as a whole. We need to break it down into what people are doing online. So now we're going to the questionnaire results. And we can see that the ability to multitask influences internet use. So between 33 and 52% of participants say that their ability to multitask influences their decision to participate online rather than offline. And it was in the top 3 of responses. We gave them 11 factors that they could choose from. Being able to multitask was one of them. And it was the most important activity for all of these. The ability to multitask came in the top 3 for all of these activities in persuading the option of doing the activity online or offline. So this table here, the tables refer to not to the presentation but to the paper. So the question, can you multitask more when doing the following activities online than when doing them offline? for all of the activities, people say, yes, I can multitask more when I'm online than when I'm offline. And if we add the yes and the sometimes together, we can see that for most activities, between 90 and 97% of people say that, yes, I can multitask more when I'm online than when I'm offline. And quantitative data support these findings as well. And the quantitative data revealed that multitasking online is particularly important for people during childcare. So, conclusions. Multitasking is prevalent and it's important. And it does seem as though the internet influences the ability and propensity to multitask. It influences the nature of multitasking, increasing the number of activities that can be multitasked, as we hypothesised. And we also suggest that it increases activity participation, so the internet is likely to be important for issues of social exclusion by enabling multitasking and enabling the increase in activity participation. So there are implications for the study of internet impacts. We need to record multitasking if we're going to understand what impact the internet is having on society. These databases are soon to be available online, so people can take them away and do their own analysis. I think there's very important room for future research in thinking about methodological development. How do we record multitasking? Now, we did a diary, focus groups, and questionnaire survey. They all suggested that multitasking is very important, but they all suggested that people aren't aware of their multitasking. So how do we ask someone about something when they're not aware of it? And there's also important work to be done in thinking about theoretical and conceptual development. So yes, here are my contact details, and thanks again to the EPSRC, DFT and CTS.
Okay, thank you very much, Susan. Do we have any questions on that before we move on to the next presentation? Yes?
Well, I have a comment more than a question. This relates to the conceptual issue of what multitasking is. And I think perhaps you overstate the case of the Internet's ability to affect multitasking. But multitasking effectively means doing more than one domain of thing at the same time. Whether that's conceptually meaningful to the person describing their activities is something that's a bit more open to question. Take, for example, older people that used to go to the post office for a chat as well as to pick up their pension. So they get social as well as a financial and across two domains. Or people that walked to school in the 1960s who would have seen this as transport to school, but it was also part of their daily exercise. Whereas today, a far higher percentage of children are driven, and so they don't get that exercise. But if you ask people in the 60s what were you doing, it was just going to school, as opposed to I was exercising and going to school. Whereas in the context where the car is much more common and people choose to walk, they will often tell you, I'm walking because I want my exercise as well as it's cheaper. And therefore it's defined as multitasking because exercise is now conceptually an issue. So some of the levels of multitasking that are declining, like I think there's an increase in some while there's a decrease in others. Because of the way pensions are now distributed mostly to electronic bank accounts, older people don't have that go to the post office with a social interaction multitask opportunity that they once did. So I think it's a little bit too simple to say that the internet increases if there are net decreases as well in terms of technology change. And that the ultimate issue for time use data is to think about what domains of things we want people to record so that it is possible to look at overlaps across domain, whether or not it's necessarily meaningful to a person in terms of how to describe a particular account of a day as how you ask the question and give that account will vary how they answer it.
I think the important thing about the internet is it increases the range of activities that are available to people to multitask. So, for example, one of the qualitative responses that we had was somebody, the internet had brought education into her living room, which meant that when the children, she could conduct her childcare, albeit passive childcare at this point, and conduct her education online. Now, that wouldn't have been possible to multitask in that way before the internet.
Couldn't you have read the book on a laptop?
Unlikely, because online education is quite different. It's very interactive. It's not just about reading a book, it's about interacting with your fellow students and with your tutor. The range of activities that are online isn't just reading. It's a much more developed learning experience online.
You said she couldn't have multitasked her educational activity and childcare activity. without the internet. I think that's necessarily true.
She could have conducted certainly aspects of the educational experience, but she couldn't have done the type of learning that is available online, which isn't available offline unless you travel to a seminar or to a library or whatever.
Okay, but if you go back a few steps before that, though, people did childcare and paid work without it being a problem, because in previous decades it was acceptable for children to be with parents in a higher number of contexts. Mm-hmm. Whereas today the workplace has been redefined. So you brought your 3-year-old to the office, what's wrong with you? And then you have social pressure put on you not, or company policy pressure not to do that. So that, yes, the internet in terms of the current office workplace environment context does make that multitasking opportunity available, but the multitask opportunity was available before and then was removed in terms of the change of the way workplace context is set up.
Was there a question? Did you have a question?
I was just going to ask if you could define a little more what you mean by online and offline.
Yeah.
Because it was sort of presented, but I was wondering what constitutes being online and what constitutes exactly being online and exactly being offline.
Yeah. This is something that the participants defined for themselves. We took a very literal definition of it. In the activity codes, we didn't, as Ben suggested in his presentation, have the activity and then a mode of access. We had, so for example, we would have in the activity code list shopping online, what else can you do online? Education online, religious activity online, or whatever. And people would classify that themselves by writing down the specific code.
The reason I asked the question, I was wondering about the qualitative differences that a lot of us will have experienced between having a permanent connection and then having a discontinuous connection. And the change in the way that we actually use computers as a result of having, say, a broadband access and having a dial-up access.
Yeah, we did analyse the findings for the diary study, not yet for the questionnaire survey, but we analysed the diary study according to access and also according to people who changed over the year from dial-up to broadband, and we didn't find any effects, which really surprised us, which suggests that may be an issue more to do with us having a small sample size of 96.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Just whether when you're looking at online...
So can you just introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, Nikki Smith, BBC. And when you're looking at online, whether you're also making a distinction whether that online time was during working time or at home in the home environment.
The thing we did with this study was it's a decision that I've almost come to regret, I think. We decided that if people were undertaking paid work, we had one activity code for that. And we asked people to... so if I go back, I can probably explain it better if I show you the diary. Here we go. So here, people would write F1 for paid work, and they would write 9 to 5 or whatever where they were. Here, we asked them to guesstimate how much time in total they were spending online or in email or whatever. So they would say, well, I was at work from 9 to 5, and then I spent roughly 50 minutes sending personal emails. We asked them only to record what they were doing personal activities online, not work-related activities online within this study. We had another study running at the time that was looking at workplace internet use. We decided to remove that from this study because we thought it would complicate it a bit much. So we don't actually look at workplace internet use in this study. We only look at personal use of the internet as a secondary activity whilst someone was at work.
I was interested whether people were doing more social activities during working time.
Yeah.
So if you have the ability to have MSN or email, and it means you can have an email from your mother, 10 minutes social time during work.
Yeah.
So it's a parallel activity, maybe not one that you wouldn't necessarily take on a phone call.
Yeah, that's something that we haven't looked at actually, but you're right, you could do that with this data. You could look at that.
Okay.
I just wanted to respond to
sure.
the point about broadband. There was a study in the States by a cable company who gave both broadband PCs and broadband wireless or webpads to households. And it was the latter that made the difference because they were moved around the house. Whilst it was still a box and had to be fixed somewhere, nothing much changed. But it became part of the lived experience of leisure and entertainment where you can think about and post the product and dumping the sofa and all that. So there's a number of changes that make that.
Okay.